Good afternoon to all of our friends and various groups on our social media platforms and people around the world. Welcome to Proclaim Jesus. And today, the title of our message is God is Sovereign over Evil. And our lesson is taken from Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And we are not going to read those verses, but I will give you my commentary overview of the text. Now, have you heard the saying that God always answers our prayers? But sometimes, it is not always the answer we want. In today's text, offers a masterclass in exactly that principle. Now, I am not speaking of false prophets. I am speaking of God's prophets who usually dialogue with God and speak to the people about what God has revealed to him. Now, the prophet Habakkuk spoke to God about what he saw. He said all around him, he saw injustice, wrongdoing, oppression, violence, strife, and conflict in verses 1 to 3. Now, the godly king Josiah had loved the Lord and his law in 2 Kings chapter 23 verses 1 through 27. But Josiah was killed and replaced by his wicked son, Jehoiakim, who did what was evil in the Lord's sight. In 2 Kings chapter 23 verses 36 to 37. And Judah, yes, Judah's citizens followed his example. So the prophet Habakkuk did something about it. He was a praying man and cried out to God. But his prayers seemed to go unanswered. He said, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, and you do not listen?" In time, the prophet decided God was taking too long to come through. Then he asked the Lord, "Lord, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Yes. Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? The prophet questioned whether God would allow evil and injustice to rule the land of Israel. In verses, yes, to rule the land of Israel. Now, in verses 5 to 11, the Lord decided to answer the prophet's prayers. But it was not quite the answer the prophet had in mind. Now, have you ever felt alone in standing for justice in the world while God seemed to be indifferent? This happens when we forget that God alone can see the whole picture. And He is working out His sovereign plan. Yes, He is working out His sovereign plan in the midst of chaos. The Lord will decide when to answer our prayers and whether or not to grant our petitions. Here, the prophet urges, yes, in fact, the prophet argues that when justice does emerge, the law is ineffective. In order for the laws to bite, it must have teeth. Now, there seem to be some form, in fact, there should be some form of enforcement behind them. The prophet wondered why God did not do something about the wickedness of Judah. In verse 5 is one of the most well-known verses in Habakkuk. It often cited as a promise that God will do something big and amazing. And it is. Yes. God said, "Look at the nations, watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." But we must be mindful of the context. Now, what is this amazing thing the Lord would do? The Lord said, I am going, yes, the Lord said, I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and hasty people. The Babylonian also they are also referred as the Chaldeans. Isn't this the people who would later sack Jerusalem, destroy their temples, and take Daniel and his three friends, along with many thousands more, into captivity. Yes, those Babylons, in fact, those Babylonians, the Lord decided, yes, in fact, the Lord described them more fully in the remaining verses of today's text. They are a bitter and impetuous nation, impetuous nation that marches across the earth. Yes, marches across the earth. Yes, seeking to seize open territories. They seize dwelling that is not their own. In verse 6, they are a feared and dreaded, yes, they are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves, and they promote their own honor. In verse 7, these people are intent on violence. In verse 9, mocked kings and scoff rulers. In verse 10, and they are guilty people. When, yes, they are guilty people whose own strength is their Lord. In fact, their God. Their own strength is their God. In verse 11. In other words, the Lord responds to the prophet complaint about the wickedness of about the wickedness in Israel by saying that he is raising up a mighty and incredibly powerful nation. In, yes, a powerful nation, a nation that worship only itself. Now, the implication here is clear. The God will use Babylon. Yes, the God will use Babylon to discipline his people. Now, do you find comfort in God's sovereignty over all people, including evil nations like Babylon? How would you respond if you were the prophet Habakkuk? If you were in the shoes of the prophet Habakkuk? Now, despite the prayers of the prophets, God chose, yes, God chooses to go contrary to the prophet's prayers, to eradicate evil in Israel, Judah. God will allow the evil to continue to help bring his people back in line towards the fulfillment of his kingdom agenda. And even in our days, yes, even in our days, right now, God is permitting the Babylonian doctrine among the Gentiles. nations, to humble them. Yes, let me say that again. Now, God is, yes, let me start again. Now, despite as of the prophet, God chooses to go contrary to the prophet's prayer to eradicate evil in Israel, Judah. God will allow the evil to continue to help bring his people back in line towards the fulfillment of his kingdom agenda. And even in our days, yes, even in this time we are living right now, God is permitting the Babylonian doctrine among the Gentile nations to humble them. For instance, see what is happening in America today, a modern nation. Likewise, Babylon, an icon of every nation. It was exactly the level of evil and corruption in ancient Babylon then until God finally destroyed the ancient Babylon. Folks, this concludes my message for today, and I hope this message was a blessing. So, may God bless you. May God continue to open up your eyes, or let the scales fall off your eye, that you may see that what God is doing, yes, you may see what God is doing, not just in our nation, but around the globe. So that's why we have to trust him. The prophet Habakkuk prayed that God will eliminate or eradicate evil from, from Israel, Judah. But that was not God's plan. Yes, it was not God's plan. Instead, God decided to use an evil empire, an evil nation such as Babylon, to discipline his people, Israel, Judah. So you see, God has a plan, even in our days, despite the corruption, despite the evil intent of man. God has a plan for both Jews and Gentiles. And I promise you, he knows what he is doing. If God's permitted, then I believe he has a plan to correct it, if according to his will. So trust God. Yes. Why would God allow an evil nation, such evil in the nation, to rule over his people? Why would he choose the Babylonians to discipline or to rule over Israel? Why? Well, God knows all things. He knows all things. He knows why. Because by whatever means, to bring his people under subjection, he will do it. By whatever means, whether it is allowing or permitting evil to exist in the land of Israel, by whatever means, to bring them to their own selves, bring them to redeem them from the sins of the forefathers. Whatever means possible, God will do it. So sometimes we think of, well, this cannot be happening if it is God, but God knows exactly what it is, what he is doing. We might not approve of it. We might think, well, that couldn't be God because of the evilness of man's intent. But why would God allow it in the first place? Because we might not see, the long-term effects, but God knows exactly what he's doing to bring his people under subjection to his will. So trust God. Yes, trust him. May God bless you, and I hope you have a blessed day. In Jesus' name.